The morning had started with the kind of silence that usually comforts me. The quiet hum of nature mixed with the soft sound of Silver Creek running beyond our vegetable garden. I had stepped out with a cup of coffee, expecting nothing more dramatic than the usual sunrise over the tree line. Yet what I saw in the yard that day froze me in a way stronger than any October chill. 3 men I had never laid eyes on were crouched near the trees, hammering small red flags into the ground as if they owned the soil. Those crimson markers cut into earth that still carried my grandfather's footprints, land that had been passed down through blood, war, and court disputes across generations. At first I questioned my own eyes. Maybe they were county workers. Maybe it was a harmless mistake. But their orange vests, cameras, and the air of official detachment about them suggested a far more deliberate intrusion. I might not have known their names, but as a construction engineer, I recognized surveyor equipment instantly, and I knew exactly what kind of claims soon follow surveys. Instinctively, I pulled out my phone and called the county sheriff. Trespass is a straightforward matter, I thought. Surely law enforcement would come. Tell these strangers to pack up their flags and restore order. The dispatcher, however, treated my concern like background noise during a dull shift. Her "we'll send someone out" lacked urgency, as if strangers planting phantom authority into my yard wasn't worth rushing over. For 20 restless minutes I paced the wraparound porch, sipping cold coffee and clenching my jaw as the intruders carried on with bureaucratic precision, photographing, measuring, and staking the ground as though my family's story written in this soil meant nothing. When a deputy finally arrived, my hope flickered back for a moment. But it was snuffed as quickly as it came. The officer's conversation with the crew lasted barely 5 minutes before he stepped onto my porch with that clipped tone of artificial resolution. "This appears to be a civil HOA matter, sir," he said, tipping his hat. "Not a criminal one." The way he spoke made it sound like I was the problem for even calling, like my insistence on protecting my own fence line was an inconvenience to his schedule. As the patrol car pulled away, my stomach churned with a sharp mix of anger and helplessness. I felt as though the law itself had chosen sides, and not mine. Frustration gave me courage, and I marched down toward the men, determined to confront them directly. Yet even before my words reached them, they dismissed me like static on a radio. The leader, a heavy-set man with clipboard glued to his hands, tossed a flyer into mine. "Environmental assessment for the HOA," he muttered, as though this was supposed to shut me up. The paper was thick with official-sounding language, all about watersheds and ecological stewardship, but I noticed the formatting looked sloppy, the logos suspiciously amateur. Something about it reeked of counterfeited authority. I demanded answers, but the crew conveniently avoided my eyes, like children caught pocketing candy, trying to stay calm in the denial of guilt. And then, just as the building rage inside me reached its peak, Walter stepped onto the field of my frustration. My grandfather, 75 years of steady breath, moved with that quiet precision shaped by decades of military discipline and rural living. I heard his footsteps and the low creak of his bedroom closet before he emerged. He wasn't charging like some reckless vigilante nor brandishing menace. He simply walked down the porch with his old army hunting rifle cradled at his side like a walking stick. For him, the rifle wasn't a weapon that morning, but a reminder of boundaries, both physical and moral, that deserved respect. The entire atmosphere shifted as he approached. The crew's faux confidence shattered under the weight of this calm, elderly veteran who radiated authority earned through time and sacrifice. Walter didn't need theatrics or volume. His voice was level, measured, almost polite when he asked the heaviest question of all. "You boys have authorization certificates for this work?" The leader stammered, fumbling with his clipboard as if the thin paper in his hands could magically convert intrusion into legitimacy. Walter let the nervous excuse tumble free before delivering his second and sharper strike. "Do you have legal warrants?" His posture was unshaken, his eyes steady, asking with the kind of gravity that proved he already knew the answer. In the silence that followed, even the birdsong seemed louder, underlining how out of place these men truly were. The crew didn't debate. They didn't fight. They didn't even finish the work they had so confidently started. In less than a minute, their flags were uprooted, their cameras tossed into bags, and their white pickup rolled out of our land as if chased by something more terrifying than bullets: accountability. Walter watched them leave without raising his rifle, then turned back, his face hard but his eyes flickering with the faint smile of someone amused by how predictable cowards can be. Only then did he share the chilling truth with me. That makes 6 times they've sent people onto our land. This revelation hit harder than the trespassing itself. It wasn't random. It wasn't a mistake. It was systematic. The intrusion was no isolated incident. It was part of a larger, darker effort to unwrite our family's claim one silent step at a time. That morning ended with more questions than answers, but one fact was undeniable. I wasn't just fighting for land boundaries or property lines. I was walking into a battle for legacy, and Walter had just shown me the tone in which we would fight. Calm, steady, and unyielding. After the trespassers fled and the quiet of Silver Creek returned, I knew one truth was unavoidable. This wasn't over. Walter's revelation that such intrusions had happened 5 previous times gnawed at me like a worm through wood. The red flags may have vanished from the soil, but they had only planted deeper questions in my mind. Someone wasn't just trespassing, someone was laying claim. And if they were bold enough to forge authority in the shadow of my porch, then bold enough to do worse behind closed doors. The very next morning, with the crisp October air still clinging to the windows, I made up my mind. The battle wasn't at our fence lines anymore. It was in the records, the paperwork, the bureaucracy my own profession had taught me to navigate with suspicion. I drove into town, to the squat little brick building called the County Land Office, where truth often hides in footnotes and small print. Inside, the place smelled of aged paper and fluorescent fatigue. Rows of tan filing cabinets stood like forgotten sentinels, their drawers holding generations of disputes, claims, taxes, loves, and betrayals, all scribbled into permanence by signatures and seals. The clerk behind the counter, a thin woman with glasses dangling from a chain, pulled up our records with the dispassionate solemnity of someone used to disappointing property owners. Her frown deepened as she scrolled across her screen, each click like a tick of a countdown clock toward some inevitable disaster. According to the updated boundary chart, she said, adjusting her glasses, your property has been flagged for assessment due to watershed impact potential. Her voice carried the bureaucratic detachment of a weather forecast. But then she added, problem is, notice of such assessments requires 30 days written notification. You should have received something. A letter, at least. My heart sank as I leaned over the counter. We never received anything. No letter, no phone call, nothing buried in HOA minutes. She nodded slowly, then clicked another tab, and there, glowing on her screen like a dagger aimed at my sense of ownership, was a document with my own name signed at the bottom. A consent form authorizing environmental assessments, except it wasn't my signature. Not even close. The pen strokes dragged clumsily, the ink uneven as though a child imitating an adult's hand. My own name had been mutilated into permission. This doesn't look right, the clerk muttered, enlarging the digital signature to examine it more closely. Honestly, it looks forged. You'll need me to file a verification report with the county attorney's office. It was like staring at my reflection in a funhouse mirror, familiar, yet grotesquely bent into something alien and dangerous. The law had been weaponized against me with the oldest trick in the book, a forged signature. Even as I reeled with anger, a new voice cut across the air like oil poured onto water. Dean Mallister. Settling in all right? I turned, and there he was, shorter than expected, sharp suit, quick smile, Rick Larson. The man whose name lingered in neighborhood chatter like a troubling echo. The Greenspire representative, now standing in person, extending the kind of practiced handshake that makes you instinctively check for missing rings afterward. Just happened to be in the area, he said a little too smoothly, checking on community development paperwork. His eyes flickered toward the clerk's computer screen with oily familiarity. His timing was too perfect, as though my morning had been snatched straight from his script. I decided to skip the polite pleasantries. Your survey crew trespassed on my family's land. We never gave permission, and now I see a forged consent form with my name. His smile trembled, cracked for just a moment before he slathered it back on, all teeth and empty promises. Administrative mix-up, he chuckled. Happens all the time. But hey, Dean, if Silver Creek becomes part of a conservation zone, your property value could double overnight. Think golf resorts, ecotourism cabins, big payout. He was trying to dazzle me with dollar signs, confident greed would eclipse my outrage, but his words only hardened me. Environmental stewardship done by trespassing and forgery? I asked. His paper shuffle grew nervous, his smile more strained. Out of the corner of my eye, the clerk had been following the exchange, her frown deepening into something steely. She interrupted with quiet force. Mr. Larson's state code requires written notice and clear homeowner consent. Neither exist here, and this signature, she pointed at the screen, will require investigation. Rick's complexion drained several shades lighter. For the first time, the developer's mask slipped. He still spoke in platitudes about long-term community value and market trends, but now his words had the hollow ring of desperation. Out of his briefcase came one last ploy, a retroactive consent form. In his mind, he could paper over fraud with more paper. Just sign this belated agreement, Dean, and all complications vanish. But I'd finally seen the seams of their operation. The fake logos, the forged claims, and now the bait-and-switch salesmanship of a man who'd rehearsed this routine too many times in other towns. I declined. My refusal shifted something inside me. What had been a confusing attack on my property was slowly revealing itself as a pattern of corruption reaching far beyond Silver Creek. That afternoon, as I pored over the counterfeit paperwork, anger gave way to clarity. This wasn't about one mistaken form. Greenspire operated like a parasite cloaked in conservation rhetoric, using grief, urgency, and amateur seals of authority to bleed communities out of their heritage. Walter had warned me something deeper was happening, and he was right. The forged signature was just the tip of a longer spear aimed directly at our pride, history, and land. The soil outside may have been emptied of red flags, but in the documents inside the county office, the invasion was still advancing, bureaucratic, quiet, and relentless. That night the house felt heavier than usual, as though the century-old boards themselves carried the weight of everything I had learned. I sat hunched over the forged documents at the kitchen table, replaying Rick Larson's fake smile in my mind, wondering how many families before mine had been cornered by the same cheap tricks. The paper in my hand stank of manipulation. The logos, the lifeless jargon, the counterfeit signature, all of it designed to transform theft into community development. But as I brooded, a different set of footsteps brought me out of my fury. Walter appeared from his room carrying something I didn't expect. An old leather-bound journal, the cover scuffed from decades of wear, its pages yellow with ink that had almost faded to silver. He placed it on the table in front of me like someone presenting not just a book, but a weapon. "This belonged to your great-great-grandpa," he said. His voice was measured, carrying that no-nonsense tone I'd grown up with. He gestured quietly for me to open it, and I obeyed. The pages were filled with cramped cursive, patient handwriting that detailed boundary disputes from the 1960s, hearings in county courtrooms, survey costs down to the penny. I flipped through entries about men in suits trying to tell him where his creek was, about paying independent surveyors to prove them wrong, about neighbors who thought they could stretch fence lines without consequence. Each entry felt eerily familiar, like history was circling back to bite us in the exact same place. Walter's gaze stayed fixed on me, and I could tell he had been waiting for years to show me this. Then he turned to a page with a date that made my blood run cold. March 1964. In stiff handwriting, my ancestor had recorded, "Family grave markers moved 30 feet west. Suspect deliberate tampering with boundaries." I stared in disbelief. Not only had our family fought to protect living land, someone decades ago had literally tried to move the dead to shift maps. My chest tightened. It was no longer just trespass or assessment trickery. This was generational theft, sharpened over time like a blade, cutting through records, courts, and even cemeteries. Walter didn't look surprised. He had clearly read these entries hundreds of times. "They've been trying to redraw history, Dean," he said quietly. From under the coffee table, Walter pulled out 2 maps rolled into tubes. One paper was brittle, ink faded, but still clear enough. The official military survey map from 1964, marking Silver Creek exactly where it flowed today. The second was newer, slicker, with digital seals and logos that reeked of bureaucratic legitimacy. On that version, the property line shifted 30 feet inward, narrowing our land and pulling part of the creek outside our ownership. When he laid the maps side by side, the theft became undeniable. It was a cartographer's quiet crime, the alteration of inches on paper that equated to acres in reality. I leaned back in my chair, staring at those lines, struggling to process the implications. Someone in the county records department had maintained two sets of truths for decades, one for legal residents and another for developers who needed the land. Greenspire hadn't invented this deception. They had inherited and perfected it. They know exactly what they're stealing, Walter said darkly, tapping the newer map with a gnarled finger. And they've been planning it longer than you've been alive. His tone wasn't angry, just resolute. The way a soldier talks about the position of the enemy and how the terrain betrays you if you stop paying attention. What rattled me most wasn't just the maps or the grave markers. It was Walter's notebook. Page after page documented every incident. Trespassers at the creek, surveyors with excuses, strange vehicles at the edge of the property. There were photographs, too, taken through his bedroom window with military precision. Images of men planting flags, crews photographing our home, even late-night reconnaissance with flashlights near the tree line. I realized with a hollow twist in my gut that while I had been distracted rebuilding my life after divorce, Walter had been fighting a quiet war of vigilance, sleeping light, rising early, recording everything. He had been a sentinel against an enemy I had barely believed existed until now. The scale of the deception widened with each page he showed me. Altered property tax assessments, utility easements quietly redrawn, water rights transferred to phantom authorities we had never heard of, permits filed under our name for contamination studies we had never authorized. Every paper was a dagger, and each dagger carried the same fingerprint, someone on the inside. Walter's handwriting in the margins revealed his suspicions. Signature comparisons between county employees, notations about forged documents, questions scrawled about which officials might be feeding Greenspire the ammunition of paperwork necessary to dismantle our claim. As his evidence piled across the table, I began to see the trespass not as a single act, but as the latest stitch in a much larger tapestry. These weren't red flags marking soil. They were hunting markers in a campaign designed to carve away legacy piece by piece until nothing was left but luxury development and recreational golf courses watered by a stolen creek. I wanted to argue, to cling to the illusion that surely no one would go this far. But Walter ended that thought with one sentence. "This is the 6th time they've tried," he said firmly. "The longer we keep quiet, the more history they erase." "And Dean?" He locked his steel blue eyes with mine. Sometimes a man doesn't get to choose whether to fight. He just chooses how. As I held his gaze, the full weight of my bloodline hit me. My great-great-grandfather had fought in war and then fought again in court. Now it was our turn. In Walter's leather journal and brittle maps, the past was still speaking, still demanding. And I knew then that the fight had already chosen us. The morning after Walter laid those maps on the table, I realized that the battlefield was no longer confined to the soil beneath our boots. The true war wasn't only against forged signatures or county corruption. It was seeping into living rooms, front porches, and whispered conversations between neighbors. Greenspire's schemes were dangerous, but what gave them teeth wasn't just bureaucracy. It was the complicity of people who lived right next door. If land is sacred, then community is supposed to be the army protecting it. What I found was a community quietly divided, some tricked into surrendering, others willing to sell loyalty for profit. That discovery hurt worse than the survey flags. I started with Mrs. Thompson, the neighbor who had maintained her rose garden with the devotion of a cathedral keeper. If anyone had her ear on the pulse of our neighborhood, it was this woman. She had lived 2 decades longer on that street than I had. I expected commiseration, outrage, maybe even alliance. Instead, when I told her about the trespassing and the forged papers, her brows folded in confusion, not anger. "Oh, but Darla explained all of this," she said as she clicked open a folder at her kitchen table. She told me it was just about preserving the natural character of the neighborhood. Her late husband cared so much for the environment. She said signing this was honoring his memory. The papers she showed me hit like a hammer, foolproof friendly language framed in conservation buzzwords. Yet scrolling through the paragraphs, I could see the truth buried half a page down. Broad survey rights had been signed away to any approved environmental consulting firm. Mrs. Thompson, kind and well-meaning, had essentially given Greenspire open access to her property and ours, without even realizing it. The betrayal wasn't hers. It was Darla's. Darla, recently widowed, had been knocking on doors with tear-filled eyes and carefully practiced stories about Frank's dying wish for conservation. She wasn't just collecting signatures. She was weaponizing grief, leaning on neighbors' compassion and their reluctance to scrutinize fine print. What she handed them wasn't a petition to support stewardship, but a legal knife granting developers a free hand. But not everyone felt tricked. At the Martinez house, I was met with unapologetic candor. I knew what it meant, Mr. Martinez admitted. Look, Dean, property values around here have been flat for years. If the developers want to turn this into a resort community, my place will triple in value. That's my retirement money. Why should I care if some cracked old creek becomes a golf course hazard? His wife nodded from behind him, arms folded, entirely unsympathetic. In their eyes, Greenspire wasn't a threat, but an opportunity dressed in green packaging. For them, Darla hadn't lied. She'd offered a deal they wanted to take. That, I realized, was Darla's genius. Her pitch changed shape for every neighbor. For the sentimental, it was about Frank's love of conservation. For the calculating, it was about cashing in before moving to cheaper pastures. Each conversation was tailored like a suit, custom fit to the fears or hopes of whoever answered her knock. Some neighbors were crying as they signed. Others were grinning. Either way, the signatures were the same, all funneling power into Greenspire's hands. By the time I had finished canvassing half a dozen homes, patterns emerged like muddy footprints across a clean floor. Grief weaponized, greed indulged, suspicions sowed between long-timers and newcomers. Everyone thought they were signing different things, but the fine print betrayed them all equally. The worst was a visit to a corner house where the resident leaned in close after listening and murmured, "Be careful, Dean. Some of us have worked with developers before. Sometimes it pays to look away. Sometimes it pays to cooperate. Stirring trouble doesn't usually pay." He gave a little smile with no humor behind it. Accidents happen in these woods. My blood chilled at the casual threat, wrapped up in neighborly friendliness. This wasn't just paperwork anymore. Greenspire had dug its fingers into loyalties and pocketbooks, and now fear was part of the equation. When I finally confronted Darla directly, pushing for a community assembly, her mask slipped. On the phone, her tone hardened from sweet familiarity into cold formality. "Environmental assessments are routine," she insisted. "They don't require a special meeting. You're exaggerating minor misunderstandings." I cut her off with legal citations I had picked up from the county office. Requirements for 30-day written notification, rights to contest, statutes defining HOA obligations. My words rattled her facade, enough that she reluctantly agreed to call an emergency assembly. The night of that meeting, tension seeped into the little community center like the smell of stale coffee that clung to its walls. Every chair filled with neighbors, some curious, some angry, others already bristling with skepticism toward me. Darla stood at the front, posture perfect, voice rehearsed, trying to carry the authority of leadership she no longer deserved. She opened with calm dismissal, painting me as the antagonist, the bitter outsider stirring chaos after moving back from my divorce. Her performance was polished. Years of chairing neighborhood bake sales had made her fluent in the art of smiling while stabbing. Some nodded. Some scowled at me. For a moment I felt the room tilting toward her version of reality. But when I demanded she explain in front of everyone why no 30-day notification letters had been sent, the silence was suffocating. Faces turned toward her, suddenly uncertain. For the first time, her composure cracked. She tried redirecting blame to a rogue HOA member no longer on the board, claiming she herself had been a victim of their overreach. It was a clever pivot, but too slick, too convenient. And when Walter entered quietly from the back and asked that one devastating question, "Who sold the creek rights?" the room shifted again. It was as if someone had fired a gun into the air. Conversation stopped, eyes widened. The gravity of water rights, deeper than boundaries, deeper than surveys, began to settle on every face. Darla stammered, denied, deflected. But Walter, patient and unyielding, produced the county records showing the creek's legal transfer to Greenspire months earlier. There it was, stamped, sealed, undeniable. A fraud masquerading as stewardship, a betrayal masquerading as leadership. The community erupted in chaos, voices clashing like storms colliding. Some shouted for Darla to resign, others demanded lawsuits, and more than a few simply sat there stunned. realizing too late that they had been pawns in someone else's game. Darla's careful lies had finally cracked, and the truth bled out across the room like sunrise breaking through clouds. The battle for the land had widened into the battle for memory, and I saw it clearly. Darla had divided our neighbors like wedges, but now, bit by bit, the wedges were splintering. Truth was reclaiming the room. By the time the fifth confrontation arrived, the first four had already toughened me into something I hadn't realized I could be. Less a homeowner, and more a soldier in a battle my ancestors had already fought in their own ways. Still, when I woke to find yet another survey crew loitering by Silver Creek a few mornings later, I felt that crackle of disbelief, like surely they wouldn't try again. Not after evidence, not after meetings, not after Walter's rifle had spoken into the October air. But there they were, bold as brass, hammering stakes into the earth as if our family name were graffiti they could scrub away with a few cheap flags. This time, though I wasn't going to let the story unravel in silence, I set my phone on the porch rail, propped at just the right angle, and hit go live. The stream ticker rose fast, a few dozen, then 100, then hundreds more, as neighbors and strangers alike tuned in to witness whatever came next. If they're here to run another so-called assessment, I told the camera, my voice steadier than I felt, we're going to put their tactics on record in real time. No edits, no excuses. Everyone's going to see exactly how crooked development works when it thinks nobody's paying attention. I approached the men, the live feed catching every detail. The leader was taller than the others, clipboard in hand, the very picture of dismissive arrogance. We have authority to complete an environmental evaluation, he said without making proper eye contact. The HOA granted full access. He tried to brush past me as if my home, my heritage, and my family's sweat in the soil were just paperwork clutter. I demanded permits. What he offered instead was another forged signature scrawled under my name. I didn't argue. I simply lifted my phone closer to his clipboard so the hundreds of watching eyes could see the fraud for themselves. That's not my signature, I said, my voice carrying power only because strangers across the internet echoed it back in a chorus of angry comments. Rick Larson slithered onto the property not long after, trailed by a hired security guard who looked less like a protector and more like muscle pulled from the local bar. Rick opened his mouth and outpoured his usual sell job, cheerfully varnished words about stewardship, community, rising property values. But the camera stripped his act naked. His grin looked forced, his lines rehearsed, and every pause betrayed the fear of a man trapped in his own spin. The live comments were merciless. Viewers who'd seen his type before calling out his con, citing their own experiences with predatory development. Stripped of secrecy, his performance collapsed, but the crew kept working, stubborn in their delusion of authority. When I stepped between them and the creek, the security guard moved forward as though intimidation might still tip the scales. That was the mistake that summoned Walter. He stepped out from the porch with the deliberate rhythm of someone who'd been preparing for this day his entire life, rifle casually at his side. He didn't shout. He didn't posture. He didn't need to. A single shot cracked into the sky, a punctuation mark heard by every creature in those woods and every viewer watching the live stream with breath caught in their throats. That, Walter said calmly, was a warning. Leave now. For once, the invaders froze. Their bravado sunk into the earth. Even Rick's chattering tongue stumbled into silence. But before they could retreat, the keening wail of sirens rolled through the valley. Patrol cars arrived with a rush of blue and red, tires kicking dust where minutes earlier red flags had been planted. Officers stepped out, their wary eyes flicking between my grandfather's rifle, the survey crew's equipment, and my phone, which I refused to lower. The investigation unfolded live. I handed over the folder we'd kept containing proof of forged signatures, altered maps, and Sarah Mitchell's legal analysis. The police questioned Rick and his crew. For every vague claim they made about permits and authorization, all I had to do was tilt the phone toward them, evidence in hand, my live audience keeping receipts in real time. The authority Rick had worn like a costume unraveled thread by thread, until an officer finally spoke the words we'd been waiting for. Mr. Larson, you have outstanding warrants in 2 other states. Rick's confident salesman act curdled in an instant. His wrists were cuffed, his smile gone. The live feed comment stream erupted like fireworks. The fallout spread faster than Silver Creek after a storm. Local news showed up within hours, amplifying the broadcast that had already gone viral overnight. Headlines splashed across morning screens. Developer arrested in property rights scam and fake environmental assessments uncovered in live stream. Greenspire's carefully polished cover crumbled under a national microscope. Within 72 hours, their projects across multiple states were frozen pending federal investigation. Lawsuits poured in. Fines bled their coffers. The eco-conservation mask dropped, revealing luxury resorts and golf courses built on stolen ground. The HOA meeting that followed shattered what remained of Darla's control. This time the building was full, not reluctant neighbors but furious shareholders of a community betrayed. The vote to remove her wasn't just unanimous, it was thunderous. Some shouted, some cried. One kind-hearted woman looked heartbroken more than angry, still grieving for trusting a widow who had sold them out. Darla left the room alone, stripped of her role, her reputation, and soon enough her legal freedom. The months that followed were quieter, but heavy with meaning. Walter stored the rifle back in his closet, its purpose fulfilled without taking life but ensuring justice. We rebuilt not just trust and boundaries but trust among neighbors, now united by a shared scar. The community held a barbecue beside Silver Creek, laughter and smoke mingling with the steady ripple of water as children ran over ground that would remain theirs, unmarked by red flags. Walter became a symbol that evening as neighbors clapped his shoulder with gratitude, calling him not just a veteran but the man who had finally drawn the line. One crisp evening, 3 months later, Walter turned to me as the sun laid gold across the creek. "Tomorrow," he said, pointing to the old oak nearby, "we're going to bury a time capsule. The original map, the court papers, and one bullet. So they'll know what this family had to do to keep its land when liars came calling." His words weren't dramatic. They were a simple record like his father's journal entries. To him, the fight had never been about glory, just memory. Land, water, history, the things too many forget until someone steals them. The creek still flowed where it always had. Our family still stood where it always would. And the red flags, those little steel lies hammered into sacred soil, were gone. What remained was a lesson etched deeper than property lines. Even against fraud, forgery, and smooth-talking thieves, sometimes the smallest stand of a quiet man on his porch is enough to unravel the biggest lie.